Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to a Reagan Forum, hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The Center for Public Affairs offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Of the Supreme Court, President Reagan wanted a court that, quote, should interpret the law, not make it, end quote. The role of the Supreme Court, in his view, was to make sure that principles of law are based on the Constitution. Over the years, the Reagan Foundation has been honored to host many Supreme Court justices as part of its programming, including Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justices Amy Coney Barrett, Sonia Sotomayor, Samuel Alito, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Clarence Thomas, Anthony Kennedy, and Sandra Day O'Connor. In today's Reagan Forum podcast, we bring you our August 8, 2024 in-person event with Justice Neil Gorsuch, his second visit with us. During the program, he discussed his book, Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law, which brings attention to increasingly complex laws that take away America's freedoms and undermine respect for the law. Centered around the lives of real people who are feeling the tolls of excessive regulation, Overruled provides readers with key insights into the preservation of liberties for generations to come. During the program, Justice Gorsuch sat down in conversation with Reagan Foundation and Institute Board Chairman Fred Ryan. Let's listen.
We've got your book. It's just come out, and it's fantastic. And what's so great about it to me is there are these individual stories about real people and how they've been affected. And I thought maybe we could talk about some of those individual stories and then maybe some of the broader conclusions that could be drawn from it. So just to start off and set the stage for this conversation, a central argument of your book is how the sheer volume and complexity of our laws swallows up ordinary people. What inspired a jurist such as yourself, someone whose livelihood is based on the existence of laws, to write a book suggesting we need fewer laws?
First, Fred, can I say thank you? Thank you for having me out here. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to do this. And I want to thank all the people of the Reagan Library who've been so kind to me today, from the docents to the guards to the director, David. Really appreciate the hospitality, the chance to walk through the library. Every time I come here, I learn something new, right? And it's just a magnificent place, especially for you young people. I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? Yeah, and so it's a treat for me as much as it is for you. So thank you for having me. I really am grateful to be here and love being on the west side of the Mississippi, always. So you're asking, what on earth is a lawyer saying we have too much law? And that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, I made my whole livelihood out of all these laws, and thank you very much. But the truth is, I've been a judge now for coming on 20 years, and I have just seen so many cases come through my courtroom where ordinary Americans, decent, hardworking people who are trying to do their best, were just getting, and there's no other word for it, thwacked by laws unexpectedly. And, you know, when law is about common morality, things we can agree on, things we know intuitively, things your grandmother taught you, okay, fair enough. And if you pretend you didn't know, ignorance is no excuse. But what happens when you had no idea, and you could have had no idea? And these things built up over time, and they niggle at you, those cases. Those are the cases that you go home with, and you think about those people. And I decided it was time for me to really sit down and study the problem and think about it carefully. And I picked one of my famous former law clerks, who's fantastic to help me with this. She's marvelous. Her parents escaped communism, Czechoslovakia, in 1968 and came to this country. And I don't know a young woman who loves this country more or its liberties more than Janie Nitze. She's also one of the smartest people you ever meet. First generation in this country, 3 Harvard degrees, clerk for Sonia Sotomayor and Gorsuch, all right? And so that's who I worked with on this. And you're gonna hear her name a lot in the future, I know that. So that's what led me into this problem. And then maybe we can talk about what happened next. But
Yeah, just how you describe in the book the proliferations of laws made by Congress, regulations by federal agencies, acts becoming treated as crimes. And could you paint the picture for the audience on how that's grown? How did we get to this point?
well, so after thinking I gotta think about this more carefully, I started spending some time with Janie, just really trying to understand what is happening in our law. Is this just anecdotal experience, or is there something that am I right about something here? And what we found is, in short, that the law in this country has exploded in just my lifetime. In my lifetime. So put some meat on the bones. There are now, well, the entire US code, all of the laws passed by Congress could fit in one book at the beginning of this country, even 100 years ago, and a slim book at that. Today, it occupies an entire wall in my office. You don't think Congress is busy? Where's the congressman? Yeah. You were busy. You were busy adding 2 to 3 million new words to the law every single year. That's how busy they are. And of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? So much of our law is now made by agencies. How busy are they? We have something called the Federal Register where they're supposed to publish their rules. Now, not all of them get in there, all right? But that was the theory, nice theory you have there. And 100 years ago, in the 1930s even, the average length of the Federal Register was like 20 pages a year. Okay? It's 60 to 70,000 pages every single year. Okay? And then we started looking further. Okay, that gets your attention. How about crimes? There's a lot of these cases where people being criminally pursued by the government. How many federal crimes do you think there are? Well, the answer is nobody knows. Because Congress just dumps in we have Title 18 that's supposed to be about crimes, but they just add them in everywhere as they go. And somebody at the Department of Justice in 1982 during the Reagan years said, I'm going to count them up, and devoted like 2 years, don't quote me on that, but something like that, 2 years, and gave up. She had, at that point, 3,000 in number. Well, the federal code, again, what Congress has done, has doubled in length since 1982, and so have probably the federal crimes. There are conservative estimate over 5,000 federal crimes. What about those regulations? Again, nobody knows. There are at least 300,000 federal crimes in those regulations on top of that. So that's the kind of problem or issue, maybe it's not a problem to some people, but that's the issue I wanted to explore.
With no offense to my fellow lawyers who are here tonight, does saying we have too many laws mean we have too many lawyers?
Well, you'll not be surprised to learn that with so many laws, the number of law schools and law school graduates has far outstripped the population growth of this country in the last 70 years. I've been 3 times easily, all right? The income for lawyers has just grown exponentially. I mean, if you're at a major law firm in a major city today, average partners are making many millions of dollars. Even in cities like in my, more humble places than Los Angeles, like Denver and in Kansas City, you have lawyers who are charging thousands of dollars an hour for their time, right? Just to have an average contract dispute today, ordinary run-of-the-mill stuff can cost $60,000, okay? That's the average salary of an American. I couldn't afford my legal services as a lawyer. That's the truth of it. And of course, these kids coming out of law school are also burdened by massive debt. I've got law clerks who are coming out with $150,000 in debt from law school and another couple $100,000 from college. And of course, they're going to take a high-paying job. They have to, right? So it feeds on itself. So yeah, there are too many lawyers, but that's a product of our system.
Speaking of our system, let's get into the stories that you have. One of them is about a fisherman in Florida, small business person, and all of a sudden federal armed agents arrive And he finds himself facing a law that was meant to address the Enron scandal. Can you tell us what happened to that fisherman and how that overreach got to him?
Sure. So I thought the best way to approach this problem, you don't want to hear just all facts and figures, right? You want to see what this has meant to people, the kind of people that I was talking about earlier that I've seen in my courtroom. And so I wanted to tell their stories, and we interviewed some of them. And their stories are in the book. And I think among the more powerful is this one you're speaking of, Fred, which is John and Sandra Yates. They were high school sweethearts, grew up near Lake Erie. He loved to fish. They'd moved down to Florida so he could become a commercial fisherman and be near family. He worked his way up from deckhand to captain of his own small crew, 2-3 men. They've been out for a few weeks after red grouper. They have thousands of pounds of red grouper in the hold. Alongside comes someone, he flashes a badge and says, I want to make sure they're all the right size. They got to be 20 inches, okay? Remember that. He says, I got thousands of pounds. Agent says, I've got all day. So he brings out a stick and he measures every single one of those red grouper. Now, he finds some of them that are under 20 inches. They're all over 18, most of them over 19, but there are 72 that he thinks are undersized. Now, John disputes that to this day. I spoke to him earlier this week. He still tells me that that guy didn't know how to measure red grouper because he didn't account for the lengthy lower jaw of a red grouper. And under federal regulation, John says, you're supposed to account for the full length of that jaw, and he was measuring at the nose, not the area. 72 it was, and the agent says, well, you put him in a box, and I'll deal with you when you come back to port in a few days. A few days later, he comes to port. Guy measures them all again, but this time he finds only 69 that are undersized. Now, John thinks, you know, of course, they expand, they contract, you put them in the hold, you take them out on hot decks, that happens. This guy's suspicious, though. He's very suspicious. But he doesn't do anything at the time. 3 years pass. 3 years pass. I'm not making this up. And Sandra is doing the laundry when she notices there are agents, you know, body armor, all the whole thing, surrounding her house. And they want to know where John is. And he's out crabbing, and she calls him in, and they arrest him. He doesn't know why. They drive him 2 hours to Fort Myers, where he's booked, and he's told that he has committed a violation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Now, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for those of you who are not lawyers, was passed after the Enron scandal. It was an accounting law, and the law basically says you cannot destroy accounting records, documents, and other tangible objects when the government is after you, okay? That's what it says. And John's thinking, what the heck does this have to do with me? The government's theory goes as follows. He learns. This takes time, by the way. This takes time to figure out what the government's theory is. The government's theory is he threw overboard the 72 red grouper that were undersized, and he replaced them with 69 still undersized fish. Now, John thinks that's about the stupidest thing anybody's ever heard, because if he wanted to throw overboard the underside, he wouldn't replace, And the government's theory is that he intentionally destroyed tangible objects, other tangible objects, to impede a federal investigation. Violation of Sarbanes-Oxley can land you 20 years in federal penitentiary. He fights this. They offer him a plea deal. He refuses it. He says, I'm not guilty of this. I'll take a citation, whatever, okay? But this is, he goes to trial and loses, all right? By the time he goes to trial, can anyone guess what the size limit for red grouper was? 18 inches. And the federal government still pursued the case. He was sentenced just 30 days in jail, you'll be happy to hear. But they were over Christmas when he was busy, by the way, trying to raise his 2 young grandchildren. He asked, could I report after Christmas? They said no. So in Christmas, there he was. At that point, he was ready to move on. He's lost his commercial fishing opportunities. You know, he's out of the industry, right? He's lost his livelihood, but he served his time. He wants to move on. Sandra says, no, we're going to fight this. This is wrong. And she just will not give up. Poor John. And they fight it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and they win. by one vote. Sandra, if you're seeing this, that's for you. So, Sandra's still angry to this day that she only won by one vote, by the way. But the thing is that the government had spent years, I mean, this is many, many years of litigation. This man's lost his livelihood. What is even winning? And they want all the vindication anybody can win in our legal system from the highest authority. He's still lost his livelihood. The family now lives in a triple-wide trailer, and Sandra supports them. Okay? Now, that's not bad enough, right? After the case, the Department of Commerce, which oversees the agency involved, decided to do a bit of investigation because maybe they have been a little too tough with the commercial fishermen, they thought. The Inspector General gets involved. He does a report. He reports to Congress, however, that his investigation was impeded a bit because one of the agents involved destroyed his documents. There was no Sarbanes-Oxley charge, near as I can tell, ever brought against him.
Right.
So those are the stories. You can see maybe why I wanted to write this book. You know, you can see why these things niggle at me at night. Those are the people that I wrote this book for and about.
One thing in your book that got my attention in a big way was where you say 70% of adult Americans today have committed an imprisonable offense. Now, I'm hoping we're in the other 30%, but
I don't know about you, Fred.
What's going on that has 70% of Americans potentially guilty of an imprisonable offense?
It's worse than that. Actually, some professors estimate, and they say if you're over 18, you have committed a federal felony. And then they say, and if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm not. Okay? And I think that might be true, all right? The fact of the matter is our prisons have exploded. Mm-hmm. There are more people serving life sentence today in this country than were serving any sentence in 1970. 1 in 47 Americans is under some form of correctional supervision today. I tell a story of Bobby Unser. Anybody old enough to remember Bobby Unser, racing superstar? Yeah. Well, he got in trouble. He's a federal convict too. He was riding a snowmobile in Colorado one winter and got caught in a terrible blizzard. Some people thought he stumbled into wilderness. He barely got out with his life. He had a hike overnight, frostbite, the whole 9 yards. And they say that during the storm he stumbled into wilderness territory, and so they brought federal charges against him for that. I tell his story in the book too. It's worse than that, but I won't bore you with it.
Could I just on that, a little bit more on that story, because he was fined $75.
$75 was his punishment.
But what was the estimated cost in prosecuting the case against him?
Millions, I'm sure. You know, and the whole thing was premised. They could never really figure out where he left the snowmobile. He was there with a buddy, and both snowmobiles died, and so they had to walk out. But they spent the night. They had to make a snow cave. There's some blizzard in Colorado in the winter, all right? And they had to hike down and finally found a landline phone in a barn, and that's how they managed to escape. They reported everything to authorities, told them all about it, and asked for help finding their snowmobiles. Little did they know that the authorities were investigating them for a federal offense. And they could never really figure out exactly where the machines were in comparison to the lines for the wilderness area. This is before GPS and all that. And he was convicted with the judge taking, and I'm not making this up, a wire on the map and trying to triangulate it where it was. In my old court, the 10th Circuit said the judge wasn't exactly great with the wire, but upheld the conviction anyway.
Another great story that you tell is about the monks of St. Joseph Abbey in rural Louisiana, and you talk about regulatory capture. How did that affect those monks?
All right. Oh, sorry about that. You can still hear me all right? All right, good. So, monks of St. Joseph Abbey in Louisiana. Monks, quiet people. Not trying to hurt anybody, right? Well, they made their living by selling trees from their forest. They live in a swamp in Louisiana, and that's how they got by until Hurricane Katrina, and that wiped out their forest. So they had to come up with something new. And they decided, well, we make caskets for dead monks when we bury them, and maybe we can make caskets and sell them. All right, it's kind of morbid, but it was a nice idea, because they're pretty good at it. And they had two models, kind of the basic model and then the fancy monk model. And they started offering them for sale, and they came blessed and everything. It's true. And the funeral home directors got very upset by this in Louisiana. And there's a regulatory agency in Louisiana, basically the Louisiana Funeral Directors, yada, yada, right? And who runs this agency, this state agency? The funeral directors, because who else cares, right? So this is what's called regulatory capture, which Fred's alluding to, and it's really a simple phenomenon, is when you have a narrowly focused regulatory institution, who's going to be most interested in it? The people with a self-interest in that regulation, right? And they will often use it to pull up the ladder so other people can't compete, right? And create what we call barriers to entry for others, all right? And it's a phenomenon that's well known, and it's part of the problem, frankly. And this institution said, well, monks, you cannot sell caskets in Louisiana unless you have a funeral director's license and you have a funeral home with a certain number of parlors and, all those sorts of. They said, well, we don't want to do funerals, and we don't have parlors. We're a monastery, and all we want to do is sell caskets, and you take them away. You do with them what you want. And they went through years of litigation and legislation. They tried to get the legislation changed so that the funeral directors couldn't control it, right? And they lost at that too. And I can't tell you how long it took them and how much money it took them. They have a happy ending. They won, and they're making caskets now, and if you go on stjosephsabbey.com or whatever it is, it's a pretty good deal, and that's the problem. It was a pretty good deal. They were underpricing the competition, and they still are, and I got nice pictures of them in the book. They're good guys. And Fred here, I learned this because after reading the book, he said, I got my own funeral director story. And if it's okay, I'm going to ask him to tell that to you too, because it involves Ronald Reagan and funeral directors and regulatory capture too. All right, so.
Well, I think as everyone here knows, President and Mrs. Reagan are buried here at the Presidential Library, and Justice paid his respects at the gravesite this afternoon. And in choosing the library, they wanted a place where they could be buried, and they liked the idea of facing the Pacific Ocean. So we went through all the approvals to be able to bury someone, because you can't just bury people anywhere. Approval to be buried, got the memorial site designed, and they were fine, but it was there, and they had peace of mind knowing that it was going to take place. And then we got contacted by the state saying, no one can be buried any place unless there is a full-time funeral director on duty. And we had built a memorial, and they'd made plans, so we came up with an innovative solution. Our library director, Ralph Bledsoe, was sent to funeral director school, and he completed the course. He became a licensed funeral director, and as a result, President and Mrs. Reagan were able to be buried here at the Presidential Library.
Now, two things about that. One, I wish I had known that story before I wrote the book, because it would have been in the book. And two, and I don't know the answer to this, but do you still need to have a funeral director on staff, and do you still have one?
Oh,
I won't tell if you don't.
Speaking of the Reagan Foundation, I would like to ask you about, we've recently launched the Center on Civility and Democracy, and the goal is to try to close the divisions that exist across America and the polarization that we're facing. And you write about a connection between civility and our ability to even sustain our republic. Is there advice you would give on how we can engage in more civil discourse in support of our democracy and in support of our communities?
Well, can I just back up kind of from that question?
Back to the funeral director?
Well, sort of, to that question, because I think they're linked, right? By now you might be wondering, why do we have so many laws? Why has this explosion taken place really since 1970, in the lifetime of some of us, at least in the room, right? It's new. This isn't the way it always was. This isn't the New Deal even. This is something different. This is our lifetimes. I think there are many reasons that have contributed to this issue, but some of it has to do with trust with one another, right? I trust you, you trust me to make good decisions. If I trust you in my local community and we can work together to solve problems, we don't need to resort to law for everything, right? Tocqueville saw this when he came to this country in the 1830s. He said, where a British lord would be responsible for a great undertaking in England, or a government would be in France, in America, people just come together and do it. And he says that was what was distinctive about us. We worked together to solve our problems. We didn't rely on anyone else to solve it for us. But what happens when we become disconnected from one another? When we don't have civility, when we don't have trust, when we don't believe the same things anymore. We don't go to church. We don't engage in poker night. We do online gambling, right? We don't do bridge night. We do Wordle, right? Elks Club, nobody's in the Elks Club, right? Just those basic human connections. What happens when those disappear? We start distrusting one another, right? And the studies show this, right? That today, more and more Americans think that the people in the other political party are not just wrong, fair, but they're evil. They're evil, right? It's not just that I disagree with you, I hate you and I want to hurt you, right? When a third of young Americans report they don't think it's important to live in a democracy and that it's important to silence voices with which they disagree when they come on campus. When we can't tolerate disagreement, I mean, how does democracy work? We debate. We bring all ideas together. We hash it out. And hopefully the best solution emerges from the wisdom of the masses, as it's called, right? Our collective wisdom is greater than any one of us, no matter how smart or what a great an expert he is, right? That's the idea. But for that to work, we have to be able to talk to one another. And we have to be able to lose, too, as well as win, right? And compromise as well as succeed. All those kinds of basic forms of democracy, the essential building blocks of democracy are what you're talking about. So to answer your question, we have a lot of work to do on civility and civics. And to my mind, they're like this.
Maybe we could talk about civics, because you make the point that preserving our liberties depends on our civic awareness. And you note that a number of states don't even require civics education in high school. And as a result of our lack of civics knowledge, less than half of Americans can name all three branches of government. So how does this lack of civics awareness and lack of American history, how does that affect us as well? And what can we do, I guess, is a bigger question. What can we do going forward?
I mean, I think we all see the problem around us. 60% of Americans would fail the citizenship exam my wife took. It's not that hard. I mean, anybody who comes to this country has to pass it, and your kids can't. A third of Americans can't name any of the branches of government. I was talking earlier with somebody in the audience, Randall, our teenage daughters, my teenage daughter at one point came in. I did a little quiz. She couldn't name the three branches of government. I mean, good God. I thought that was just by osmosis from hanging around me, How could she not? I'm sorry to out you, sweetheart. So we have a lot of work to do, and and people always ask me, what can we do about it, right? And I'm here to tell you there's no white knight, and it certainly doesn't look like some old judge from Washington. The answer has to be you, and it has to be in your local communities, and you taking ownership of your children's education again, and insisting that they learn these things. Insisting that they learn the basic building blocks of citizenship, which means respect for one another, means all this civic arts of listening as well as speaking, and it means I understand I have 3 branches, and maybe I even know why they came up with 3 branches and why there aren't 4, right? And what the dangers are of additional branches. How about that? I really do think that if there is an answer to these problems, it lies with you. And I hate to tell you that you got work to do and a homework assignment out of tonight, but I think you do.
More from a Reagan Forum featuring Supreme Court Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch after this message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now back to a Reagan Forum featuring Supreme Court Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch.
Maybe we come back to another one of the great stories you tell in the book that I love was Marty the magician and his rabbit, and how federal regulations nearly derailed his small business. What happened to Marty the magician?
So this is a Chevron case. If anybody knows Chevron, you lawyers in the room. So Marty Hahn does children's shows, and he's from Missouri. And he's busy one day pulling the rabbit out of the hat, and somebody comes up to him and says, "Do you have a license for your rabbit?" Flashes a badge. I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And Marty says, "Why, no, I don't have a license for my rabbit. Why on earth would I need a license for my rabbit?" And it turned out that if it was an iguana, he wouldn't have needed a license. He learned that. And if he wanted to eat Casey, that's the rabbit, for stew that night, no problem. But there's a law that says if you're a zoo or a carnival, federal law, or an other animal exhibitor, you need to have a license. Now that phrase, other animal exhibitor, is sort of like other tangible objects, right? You could interpret it to mean everything, or maybe you could interpret it more, well, with a dose of common sense. Anyway, the federal government had interpreted it very broadly through agency regulations that were deferred to under the Chevron doctrine by courts. Okay, if the agency says it, it must be so. And so, yes, even Marty Hahn needed a license for his rabbit. And he's a law-abiding guy, so he said, "Sure, I'll get a license." And he fills it all out, and he does it, and he gets his license. But then Hurricane Katrina, which features again in this story, happened. And the federal government said, now you have to have an emergency preparedness plan. And it has to cover everything from hurricanes to chemical spills. And Marty's like, well, I'm in Missouri. We don't have hurricanes, but we do have tornadoes. And he's telling an agent this, and I have a plan. The plan is if there's a tornado, they'll get the family in the basement, the dog, the cat, and if there's time, I will get the rabbit. Oh, well, that did not go over very, no. No, the rabbit comes first, then everybody else. So he had to hire an emergency preparedness plan expert to help him write his 28-page plan. And he was very uncertain whether that was going to be good enough, the expert was, because that was pretty short by standards for these things. And you have to submit to home inspection visits. So an agent comes one time to Marty's house and says, now show me the cage you carry the rabbit in when you go to the shows. And he says, well, it's right over here. And he says, well, now how do you know how to carry it right side up? And Marty says, well, it's got a handle on it. And the government agent, this is a federal government, these are your tax dollars, says, well, you got to have a sticker on it with an arrow pointing this way up. Marty says, where do I get one of those? Agent says, I'll send you some. 2 weeks later, he gets 200 this way up stickers in the mail. That is your tax dollars at work.
You talked a little earlier about the expense of being in a legal proceeding, and in the book you write, and I quote, put simply, low and middle income Americans face an access to justice crisis. What caused that, and how can we fix that?
Well, it's just exactly what we've been talking about. When laws become increasingly complex, you have to have increasingly complex, sophisticated, more and more lawyers with narrower and narrower areas of expertise, right? I'm sure there's some lawyers in the room today make a great living out of just dealing with housing regulations in California or real estate development, or, I mean, it's become narrower and narrower and narrower. And they charge more and more and more. And I do think there are some solutions to this too, and we talk about this in the book. Mm-hmm. And I hope we get to some happy, because there's some happy things.
I've got a happy one coming up.
All right, okay. And I have some solutions in the book for you to think about. But on this one, does everything you want to be done have to be done by a lawyer, right? If you have a simple contract, a simple will, simple trust, what about LegalZoom, right? What about a non-lawyer? And the problem is my profession has something they call unauthorized practice of law regulations. And they forbid people from engaging in the unauthorized practice, but nobody knows what the practice of law is. So it turns out to be everything that a lawyer wants to do. And so like when LegalZoom tries to go into a new state, they would often get pushed out by the lawyers. They don't get complaints from consumers, they get complaints from lawyers who they're competing with. Regulatory capture, right? You know, the lawyers are self-regulated. We have this great privilege of regulating ourselves, like Louisiana funeral directors. And we've used it to pull up the ladder. And there's lots of good reason to think that allowing non-legal professionals trained in specific areas, all these detailed areas, who will charge less because they cost less, they need less education, but can provide just as good a service, right, as a lawyer might. That might be one thing, all right? I've got a bunch of solutions in the book, but that's just one.
I'd like to come back to something we talked about last time you were here, and that was on the 5th floor of the Supreme Court, there's a basketball court, which is known as the highest court in the land. And you mentioned as a clerk, you played horse there from time to time, and I'm just wondering now as a justice, do you get any pickup games or slam dunk competitions with other justices, or any fun in that court?
There have been no slam dunk competitions among the 9 of us. No, but it's a fun place to take people because really it's just the attic, and it's been converted into basketball court. And there are a couple of things about it you need to know. One is the ceiling's very low, so if you're going to play there, you have to decide beforehand whether the ceiling is inbounds or out of bounds, because that affects your strategy, right? Another thing, back when I was a law clerk, they've replaced the floor then, but back when we used to play the law clerks against the security guards. And it was there were dead spots in the floor because it was such an old, cruddy floor. And the security guys knew where all the dead spots were, so they kind of back you into one, you're dribbling the ball, and it just dies. And the third thing you need to know is you cannot play during court, when court's in session. Because it's the attic, and it's directly above the courtroom. And if you play basketball, you can hear it echoing downstairs. There's an apocryphal story. It probably isn't true, but it probably should be true, where my old boss, Byron White, another justice for whom I clerked, he was retired at the time, was upstairs playing basketball, and downstairs, Chief Justice Rehnquist was in charge and hearing a case, and he could hear the basketball. And he was a stern fellow, and he sent a note up, according to the story, saying, whoever's playing basketball up there is fired. And when White got the note, he dashed back another one to the Chief Justice saying, can't, Article 3, life.
In the book, you mentioned several of what you're calling the sillier laws, like how in Massachusetts you cannot play the Star-Spangled Banner as part of a medley, or this one really got my attention.
Remember that one?
by federal decree, macaroni must have a diameter between 0.11 and 0.27 inches. Would we really arrest someone for making macaroni 0.28 inches? And how?
You want to try?
How do these laws get passed, and how do we abolish these laws?
Well, all right, now we get to talk about some hopeful things, right? I'm not the only one to observe these problems, happily. And there are people in states especially that are trying to address some of these problems. And there are commissions increasing, and more in the West, frankly, unsurprisingly, to try and address these old laws, these dumb laws. Idaho, for example, the state legislature adopted a law saying, we hereby abolish the entire administrative code of the state except for those provisions the governor deems sufficiently important to keep. How about that, right? Texas, after Isis Brantley, who maybe we'll talk about, another person like Sandra Yates, who just stood up and made things happen and won a case. I hope we talk about her a little bit. Texas started rethinking its licensing laws. You know, of course we need to have licensed doctors, maybe lawyers, and a few other things. Historically, we always have. But Texas had gotten to the point it was licensing 500 professions. 500, including, in her case, hair braiding. And they've now got commissions, they've eliminated a lot of those licensing laws, okay? And they also have a sunset law, which says that agencies are automatically abolished after a certain number of years unless they're expressly reauthorized. Things like that, right? They're just common sense, right? Can make a huge difference. And I do think that there is reason for hope on some of these things, right? If you insist on it, it does not take a rocket scientist to come up with these ideas. You can do this, right? And people are doing it. And so at any rate.
Well, with Brantley, I think you in the book you were setting up by talking about how there are state-issued permits or licenses required before someone can even begin to do a certain line of work. And one example was in Annapolis, Maryland, you can't even work as a fortune teller
Correct.
without a license.
Yes.
Can't imagine what that test looks like, but you mentioned Isis Brantley, a hair braider in Dallas.
Yeah.
What happened to her?
So Isis braids hair. And it's kind of an ancient art she learned from her family. It's been handed down. And she's got a huge fan base and a small shop in Texas, in a strip mall. One day, agents come in, raid her salon, and shut her down. Why? Because she didn't have a barber's license. Now, she's like, well, I'm not a barber. I don't cut hair. I don't use any tools, no scissors, nothing. Just my hands. That's it. My family's been doing this forever. Nobody's ever complained. I'm not trying to hurt anybody, right? What does it take to become a barber? 3 years. And an exam. Devised, no doubt, by the barbers. Okay, all right, you get it. And 3 years and a lot of money that she didn't have, right? I mean, she's trying to make ends meet here. She's a single mother with kids, you know? And what do they teach you in barber school? Nothing about hair braiding. Nothing. Nothing. So for a period of time, she was actually homeless with her children. But she fought this, and she fought it for years. Finally won the right to braid hair again. It was something she loved so much, she taught other women who were struggling, right? She really feels that's part of her life's mission, is to teach others and help them be able to put bread on their table too. But it turned out, even after she was able to start her business again, she couldn't teach. They wouldn't let her do that, because to teach hair braiding, you needed another license. And of course, it was the barber school license, okay? And she couldn't do that because you have to have a certain number of stations, and you have to have a certain number of tools and sinks, and again, none of that. She fought that too. It took her all in 20 years, okay? But she won. And that's part of what sparked this licensing reform movement in Texas. And this is Texas we're talking about here, folks, okay? So there are people out there really doing wonderful things, and that's what gives me hope, is people like her, people like Sandra.
One point you make in the book is how Americans are 10 times more likely to wind up before an administrative judge than a federal court. And in these administrative judges, they play prosecutor and judge. And how different is that from the federal judiciary, and why is it increasing so much on the regulatory and the executive side?
Yeah. So, what are administrative judges? How might you encounter them? If you're regulated like Marty Hahn, for example, the magician, and you are prosecuted by the agency, many of them have the opportunity, rather than to bring their charges against you in court, they can bring them before their own employees, okay? For civil matters. If they want just money from you, just money, right? Or to close your business or to take away your license, right? Your livelihood. They call themselves administrative law judges. We used to call them hearing officers, but now they like to wear robes and they have the whole thing. And at any rate, what does that look like? Do you think that administrative law judge, who sometimes reports to the same agency that's prosecuting you, is going to be as fair as somebody who's got life tenure? Doesn't care what anybody thinks, right? Nobody, go ahead, right? I don't care, right? That's the beauty of the system. That's how Madison designed it, is so that I could do unpopular things. And I could vindicate people like Marty Hahn when maybe their bosses at the agency wouldn't like that and could retaliate against that person. Do you get a jury? No jury in those cases. No jury. That's gone too. And then what do the procedures look like? Basic procedures, like getting the evidence against you and being able to cross-examine those who are charging you. Those are also very, very different. You may not get the right to cross-examination in those proceedings. And yes, today, according to Professor Jonathan Turley, you are 10 times more likely to wind up in front of one of those judges than a real judge and a jury of your peers. And so I do write about this. This is part of what's happened and changed in my lifetime in our law, and there's more about it in the book.
A couple of questions that were submitted by the audience. What was the biggest surprise to you about joining the court?
Wow, two things. One is nothing had changed. I was a law clerk there like 30 years ago, and I come back, 23 years, whatever it was, nothing had changed. We still were circulating our opinions in hard copy, and with red lines. Lawyers know red lines. We didn't do those back in the old days because we didn't have computers. We just put a pencil mark where changes were made, and you had to kind of guess what the changes were. We called those black lines. We were still circulating those when I arrived. Hard copy, right? Justice Thomas, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Kennedy, we're all still there. It was kind of a lovely fact that so little has changed to come to the court. For me personally, I think what changed most was I lost my anonymity, right? And you don't realize what a gift that is until you don't have it, and somebody's videotaping you across the restaurant while you're inartfully slurping a noodle. And for a while, I confess, that really was upsetting to me. I mean, I just made me uncomfortable. I'm a pretty private guy. Sure. But then I realized, when God closes a door, he does open a window. And the window he gave me was how many people would come up to me and have something nice to say. How much they love this country and they want it to work. And they might say, I didn't vote for that guy who appointed you, or I totally disagree with you on this case, but I'm rooting for you. And I want the court to work, and I want our country to work. And I've said prayers for you. Or, standing in line at a coffee shop and somebody just wants to tell you a knock-knock joke. I mean,
That's great.
I just have gotten to see the love of this country the American people have for it. So,
That's great to hear.
yeah.
Another question from our audience. Which historical Supreme Court justices do you most admire and why?
There are a bunch of them. You know, the fellow who had this seat before me was a pretty great guy, Antonin Scalia. I have very few beefs with him, but I have his old office. And when I moved in, tried to roll my feet under the desk and got my knees banged up against it. We're slightly different heights, which I understand President Reagan had that problem with the desk in the Oval Office, which is why that bit at the bottom was added on. You all know that. I learned that today. My other beef with him was he tried to hide his cigarette smoking from his wife by smoking at the office. So the carpet and the curtains had to go. In my seat, Robert Jackson is another hero of mine. He was a firm New Dealer, FDR Attorney General. But when he became a judge, he said a robe changes a man. And he did not hesitate to rule against FDR routinely. Now, I'm not saying that's good in and of itself, but he was just a real model for what I think being a good judge is, right? Fearless. And you can be friends with someone and rule against them, dang it. You know? He was also a beautiful writer. Here's one that not many people know, Benjamin Curtis. Benjamin Curtis dissented in Dred Scott. Dred Scott was, of course, the decision where the Supreme Court contributed to the Civil War. And the question at issue there was, do you have a right to own slaves in the territory of the United States, the territories of the United States? And Buchanan and Taney, who was Chief Justice at the time, kind of wanted to get rid of the Missouri Compromise. And they thought that was necessary to avert the Civil War. And the answer to that was to say that there would be a right to slavery in the territories, even when Congress had said no. And if you go look at the Constitution about territories, the one thing you're going to find in Article 4 is the Constitution gives Congress huge powers over the territories and says nothing about slavery. All right? It was a made-up decision under the rubric of substantive due process. It was the first substantive due process decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, a doctrine that does not have a great history. At any rate, Benjamin Curtis dissented. And it was pretty brave of him to do at the time, right? This was necessary to keep the Union together. And he said, in a great originalist opinion, one of the great early originalist opinions of the court, the minute judges start making things up that aren't in the Constitution, that's the end of our democracy. That's the end of it. And I'm not going to be part of it. And he quit the court. He was so upset by it. And he's the only justice on the Supreme Court to ever leave the court as a matter of conscience. And his portrait hangs in my office.
We're almost out of time, but I have two questions that I wanted to get in. One is, I found a quote from your former law partner, Mark Hansen. He said, and I'm quoting, "When Neil came to our firm in 1995, he had silver hair. In fact, Neil was born with silver hair." Now, I don't want to make fun of people with silver hair, but he also said that you have an inexhaustible supply of Winston Churchill quotes. Is there a favorite that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I think for tonight's purposes, and this one's probably apocryphal, but it seems appropriate for the moment. America can be trusted always to do the right thing, but only after trying all the wrong things first.
Very good. And a final question, if I may. Early on in his administration, President Reagan appointed your mother, Anne McGill Gorsuch, to be the first woman to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, I know you were a teenager then, but do you have memories of that time that you could share with us?
Well, I have a lot of memories of President Reagan. attending some of his speeches, watching his funeral. Some of my daughter's earliest memories of them on my shoulders in Washington watching the caisson roll by, and seeing those boots. As a young person, I was a teenage boy who could give a rat's rear end about my mother's job and very unimpressed by all of that. But I do remember the day she was sworn in very well because they let us run around the White House. I mean, we did. My brother and sister and I, we just pretty much ran around the White House. And the swearing-in ceremony took place in the Roosevelt room. And the president let Vice President Bush administer the oath. And there's a picture somewhere, and I'm really glad it's not in the public sphere, of me doing this above my little brother's head.
We may have that in our collection.
No. So that's a dumb teenage boy thing, but I don't know why I shared that with you, but there you are.
Well, thank you for putting together this great book, and thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Neil Gorsuch has served as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court since April 2017. He previously served as a judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit and is a senior official at the U.S. Department of Justice. Gorsuch has also been a partner at a law firm, a law professor, and a law clerk. Signed copies of Overruled can be purchased through the Reagan Library Museum Store. Every purchase you make from our catalog, website, or museum store is a critical component to our success. In short, your purchase supports our efforts to extend the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. Purchases can be made at reaganlibrary.com/store. To find a listing of all upcoming events, please visit reaganfoundation.org/events. Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Until next week, thanks for listening. God bless you.
Don't forget to subscribe to A Reagan Forum podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores, and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of A Reagan Forum come out every Thursday. Like what you hear? Check out our Words to Live By podcast, featuring radio addresses and speeches Ronald Reagan delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And don't forget to follow @RonaldReagan on Facebook, @RonaldReagan on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.